thank you, Mehdi, for inviting me to show a little bit of my work on human motor control, specifically in the context of manipulating objects, complex objects. And the point that I want to make in this conference is that control of objects and movements is clearly starting with decisions. However, they are grounded in the dynamics of the body and the task. So typically, by default, we think of the brain making decisions, planning, intentions, etc., that are then executed by the body in the context of a task. However, I want to turn your attention to the fact that the body and the task is actually very significantly influencing these decisions, such that I would like to couch what I'm telling you today in the sense of that the brain, the body, and the task form a complex dynamical system. So typically when we think of motor control, the common approach starts with a hypothesis about the controller that then evaluates intentions, costs, and makes decisions. We then move on to make simulations based on assumed parameters to generate hypotheses that we then test experimentally. Now, the approach that I would like to share with you is starting kind of the other way around. Namely, we start with an analysis of the task, the physics of the task, and then from there we define execution result variables, that is, important variables that we then use to create solution spaces, and then with minimal assumptions about the controller using primitives, we test hypotheses about human data. So this in overview, how do we actually make this work? I first want to share all these basic concepts of our task dynamic analysis in the context of a throwing task, which is exemplified here, where a person throws a ball to hit a target skittle. Here, it's a whole set of skittles. In our experiments, it is just one target skittle, where the subject has to throw a ball to swing around this vertical stanchion to hit a target on the other side. So we model this task in terms of a top-down view, such that we have a center post and a ball that then traverses around the center post to hit a target. As such, we model the task, no subject or planning or anything involved, just the task, by assuming that the ball is suspended by two orthogonal springs, is resting at its equilibrium exactly at the center post, and when you deflect the ball, such as here, and you then release the ball, it traverses the center post with an elliptic trajectory and either does or does not hit the target, where we define an error as the minimum distance from the target. Now, very importantly, and this is a simplified case of something that is virtually everywhere, the trajectory of the ball is determined by two variables that map into the error, that is one variable, so that we have a deterministic system where the ball trajectory, one more time, is determined by the position and velocity at release, leading to a single result. And the important message here is that there is redundancy in the task, exemplified in this next panel here, where three ball trajectories are simulated, and two of them are exactly hitting the target, whilst one, the blue dashed one, does not. Note that two perfect hits can be achieved by two very different trajectories, exemplifying that there is redundancy. Redundancy summarized in this graph, which spans the solution space. So release angle and release velocity fully determine the error, which is portrayed here by the color. And the lighter the color, the smaller the error. And so that white shaded area is where all combinations of release angle and velocity hit the target. In fact, it is a manifold, a set of points here that is highlighted by the black line or black set. And the red and the green correspond to releases shown here of the ball, the red and the green trajectory, and the blue that does not hit the target is this dashed blue line. So how we approach as a first step towards understanding how humans throw a ball to hit a target is by analyzing the task, and we are creating that solution space that is defined as the error as a function of angle and velocity at release, or in general way as a result as a function of the execution variables. So let's look at it in a little more practical detail. How do we perform the experiment that we then analyze the human movements in terms of this task-centered analysis? Our subjects stand and they hold a manipulandum and they hold a ball that is affixed to that manipulandum. Their movements are shown on the screen online as these rotations of this manipulandum, and when they lift the finger from a force sensor on this fixed ball, they release a virtual ball that then traverses with this elliptic trajectory around the center post to either hit the target or, well, go towards the target with a minimum error that we calculate between the center of the target and the closest point on the trajectory. So we then can look at performance in this solution space. Every trial, every throw has a release angle and a velocity that defines a point in this space. So looking at a sequence of trials, you can see like a bee swarm how these trials navigate through that solution space and settle on the light shaded areas, which are the ones with close or a very small error. So with this depiction, now we can examine learning as a way of how does this data cloud, these sets of throws actually approach that solution manifold, again here shown by this black line. And we can sort of take a loan on matrix operations where we have translation, rotation, and scaling, three operations that we can analyze in human data how they settle onto that solution manifold. So with this conceptualization, we can examine motor learning as a way of translating, rotating, scaling sets of data and, well, thereby characterize learning based in the solution space. So the point, though, that I want to make here today is that these solution spaces are defined by the target position and, as I'll show you, the release position. So these solution spaces, 4 of them shown here on the right, where I changed color, where the green now is the solution manifold and the yellow band around it is a given threshold of an error. And you can see very different geometries here of solution spaces that are simply created by placing the target in yellow here at different places. And here the release position or the release movement is confined to that manipulandum around a fixed pivot. Now, as I said, the space within which we define and decide which solutions movements we're going to do, are also defined by the release position. And here, again, I show an example with the target location. However, to show how this manifold changes as a function of the position, I'm now moving the position of the pivot on the horizontal direction, and I'm using here minus 50 centimeters to the left. This is the one right here, xp equals 0, 50 to the right, or 100 to the right. That is, if you can select your release position, again, you're creating very different solution spaces. Now, this is, one more example here, just with a different target location. We are again moving that release position from the left to the right. And you see that, again, they are very different now. So the solution space that defines the success of the task is defined by the target position and the release position. And this is what humans create when they perform a task. So here we had two virtual and a real throwing task where the release position was free to choose, whereas here it was fixed. And lo and behold, in the virtual, seemingly more easier task, because, well, we didn't have to control the whole arm and the position, the error over repeated blocks, learning, declines, but is overall less good, higher errors than the real task, where in the real task, human subjects chose their release positions as indicated here. So the two solution spaces in the virtual and the real throwing task depict here the data early and late in practice in the virtual task and the real task, where we can see by creating solution spaces, by choosing release position actually facilitates the task. So what I'm trying to show here is the task dynamic approach gives us a way to understand how we perform or decide certain throwing actions. And we have execution variables that map into result variables via the dynamics of ballistic flight and the positioning of target and the center post. And with that, we can analyze and create solution spaces as highlighted here. Okay, so this is the approach, but actually I want to go to a more complex task to show how this framework actually gives us a handle on analyzing very complex tasks. So, carrying a cup of coffee, again, simplifying it first to a very simple two-dimensional object modeled, again, by a very simple model, just like what we did in the throwing task. And then again, we go into a virtual environment where a robotic manipulander mediates how the subject can move that simplified cup of coffee, as well as experiences the interaction forces that are created between the ball and the hand, and the cup and the hand are mediated back to the subject. So the equations of motion of this simplified system are here, and it is here up to the subject, the force, the interaction force, to set this system into motion. So how do we go about to actually manipulate such a complex object? And there is certainly redundancy in here. So again, let me begin how we actually experimentally look at this type of performance. And you see that arc and a ball inside, and subjects move from the left to the right just by using this one example here. Now, this task is immensely complex, and calculations show us here. If the instruction is to just move left and right that is the cup X here is supposed to perform in a sinusoidal fashion. Depending on initial conditions, the input force has to be extremely complex because of these interactions, or it can be simpler depending on the initial condition. So what we did with inverse dynamic simulations is we swept through the parameter space, and that is we swept through the initial ball angles and different amplitudes. And then we had these time series, and we strobed the interaction forces at the point of maximum cup excursion, and then created marginal distributions here. And summarizing this, we found this amazing behavior in the cup of ball that shows that depending on the control parameter initial ball angle, we actually have an amazing set of very different cup behavior interaction forces. And then we can go and actually test alternative hypotheses. In this case, we have pursued the hypothesis that human subjects seek to improve predictability because that object is immensely complex and essentially unpredictable, or they minimize force. So we can, by using our execution variables that we identify, namely initial ball angle and cup amplitude, we can set up solution spaces where our result variable is either mutual information as a placeholder for predictability, or force, mean square force, as a placeholder for force or effort, if you wish. So these are two solution spaces analogous to the solution spaces that I showed you earlier, where we now can look, where's the minimum? Where would we expect subjects to land, and where do they then land? Because we can plot the experimental data in this very same space. And the minima just highlighted with those 2 points. Now, the data are shown here. I only show them in the left solution space because it shows very nicely how subjects actually land in an area that gives you maximum mutual information between the hand and the ball, whereas if I plotted the same data in that same solution space with a different result variable, it's far from the minimum. So I want to show that this task dynamic approach here that I introduced with a very simple task of throwing a ball can actually be extended such that instead of the simple vertical stance with a pendular ball around, I now have more complex object dynamics. I can assume very simple control inputs and then define execution variables, which was amplitude and initial ball angle, and result variables, which was mutual information or expended force, and then create solution spaces. So now I have one more experiment, but I am running out of time. But I want to just say that we now move into more complex tasks with that same framework, going into three-dimensional objects, where initially we had this very simple two-dimensional cup and a ball. We now go into three-dimensional objects. You can see the extension here. And we actually examine this model task in a real. And we have some more interesting sequential tasks where you can truly ask, why and how does the subject decide to move from one place to the other? So let me briefly just mention the task and then skip over details. Here, our task is to swirl the ball in the cup, and then upon an auditory cue, translate the cup to the other target, and, well, it's difficult at times, and not lose the ball. So in the interest of time, I will go through very, very fast. Note the exemplary trajectories. We have a result variable, which here is the distance of the ball to the rim of the cup. And we show that there is, this is a sanity check, there is indeed improvement with practice. And our execution variables are ball phase, reaction time, movement time. We then can model the task, plot and create, in this case, polar execution spaces, and test our data here in that space to see to what degree subjects have learned the dynamics of the task and exploit them. So to conclude, we can take this task dynamic approach to analyze the solutions, the options that subjects have to perform a pretty complex task. So in this case, I have different solution spaces. And to conclude, this was our task dynamic approach, analysis of task physics, defining execution result variables with minimum assumptions about the controller. I didn't go into that. We can test hypotheses. And to just go back to the beginning, I want to show that the brain, the body, and the task are a complex dynamical system. By paying tribute to this, that helps us to have a more holistic beginning that we can then tailor to actually analyze human choices, decisions. With this, I would like to conclude, thank everybody in my lab, specifically Mohsen Sadeghi, who worked on that last project, which was a big step into more complex tasks. And thank you very much. And I'm ready to ask questions.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
for very beautiful task design and beautiful result of analysis. So people listening to the lecture, if you have a question, please put into the Q&A chat box. And I have one quick question. How much subject variability did you see? So most people result in typical behavior, or other some subjects find out like a creative original solution?
So the entire approach actually was motivated by trying to understand variability that goes beyond just, say, summarizing them in standard deviation of some descriptive variables, which has been the standard approach to understand learning. Yes, you take a descriptive measure, you take standard deviations, and that goes down. Okay, but that's the end of the insight you can gain. But this variability actually has a lot more structure once you couch it in the context of what is actually possible. Because in redundant tasks, in certain dimensions, variability is just fine, right? Whereas in other dimensions, the task success is a lot more sensitive to the variability. And so by sort of realizing this is how we started to say, well, let's look into the dimensions of the task to understand how different performances and variability across individuals can be understood. And that then was really the trigger to seeing how solution spaces are a good start to understand. But of course, then how do you systematize this approach? How can you actually take it into tasks that are not just laboratory tasks, but more interesting? And that is was sort of the very compressed evolution of our approach in this short presentation.
Okay, yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. Okay, so I don't see question yet in my screen. So for the interest of time, let me move on to my talk and then come back to discussion after that. Okay, so let me start my own talk.